item on the agenda for tonight is to review for the final exam. And again, I'm going to give you topics that are going to be on the final exam. And as far as specific questions, they'll be similar to the ones that we've had before. And you can study the previous sample quizzes. So, topics that you'll need to know. You should be familiar with what a compiler is, how it relates to object code, linked code, source code. You should know what memory addresses are. You need to know how to declare a variable, how to make an input statement, how to make an output statement. You should know what a CPU is, the steps in the software lifecycle. You should be familiar with the rules for constructing a valid identifier, which can be used for variables, functions, etc. You need to be familiar with the concept of sequential code, iterative code, branching code. You should be familiar with the primitive data types, int, float, double, char. What kind of values they can hold, what kind of operations you can do on them. You should be familiar with E notation that we use to write large or small numbers in place of scientific notation. You should be able to interpret code fragments and determine either what is output by them or what various variables values will end up as. You need to know how to construct a switch statement, the kind of data that can be used in a controlling statement for and a controlling expression for a switch statement. You need to know how to interpret a Boolean expression, including a Boolean expression that may be using integers that get converted into Boolean values and or the opposite of that. You need to be familiar with the various loop control structures and the reasons for choosing one of them versus the others. You need to know how to write a typecast. You need to be familiar with how functions work, when they return values, when they don't return values. You need to be familiar with integer division. And when integer division happens, you need to be familiar with overloading functions and the rules for doing that. The difference between call by reference and call by value, and when you would use each of those. When you're writing comments for a function, what the precondition is and what the postcondition is, what the return value would be, how you would explain that in a comment. You need to know what a driver is and what a stub is and when you would use those. You need to know how to do file I/O, what libraries you need, and the member functions that you would call to open, read, check for various conditions, and close those files. You need to be familiar with the flags that can be used with the setf function with output streams. Given a function declaration, you need to know how to legally call that function. If you have an array, you need to know the various ways you can use that array, either individual elements or the entire array in a parameter list or other situations. You need to be familiar with multi-dimensional arrays, how you declare those, how you refer to them, how you would use a loop to iterate through them. You need to be familiar with C strings, how they're used with input and output streams, functions you can use with them to compare, copy, concatenate, etc. So if you wanted to assign a new value to a C string, you would need to know how to do that. You need to be familiar with pointers, how they're used with ordinary variables, how they're used with arrays, how you would use them with the new operator to create dynamic variables, including dynamic arrays. You need to know how to declare a class. You should be familiar with accessors, mutators, constructors, including the default constructor, and how to declare objects of a class using either the default constructor or another constructor. You need to know what data abstraction is and procedural abstraction, and the practical use for those in a program. You should be familiar with get, put back, get line for manipulating character data in a stream. You need to be familiar with vectors, including their member functions, pushback, size, resize, reserve, capacity. You should be familiar with the phases in the program design process. You should be familiar with short circuit evaluation and how it operates. You should know how parameters work with a function and how that relates to arguments when that function is called. You should be familiar with the file names used for file I/O, the internal name and the external name, and when you would use those. You should be familiar with the string class and how to use string objects, including the special string functions. You should know when it's appropriate to use a dynamic array versus a fixed size array. You should be familiar with structures, including hierarchical structures, and how you would refer to all of the members of a hierarchical structure. You should be familiar with the 5 components of a computer and be able to give examples of input devices and output devices. You should be familiar with the common programming errors. You should be familiar with pseudocode. You should be familiar with the common math functions and what would be produced by calling them with various arguments. You should be able to write short pieces of code to do various things. You should be familiar with the private and public labels for classes and what you would use them for, what effect they have on the program. You should be familiar with testing strategies, including testing with boundary values, using stubs, using drivers. The EOF function for input streams, input file streams. You should be familiar with code blocks, how you indicate them, and the scoping rules. You should be familiar with the null statement. And if you're familiar with all of that, you should do just fine on the final exam. The final exam will have 100 questions. It will be next week, starting at usual class start time. You'll have the entire 2.5 hours. I will not be taking roll next week, so if you would rather take the exam from some other location, as long as you have, it's your responsibility to have internet access and make sure that that doesn't get interrupted during the exam. But as long as you take the exam during the allotted time, I don't care where you take it. As usual, you can use your book, your own notes. Um, just not any outside help. Any questions about that? All right. Well, let's take a short break and then we will talk some more about our final homework assignment. So see if anybody has any questions and or needs any help.